Hello, and welcome back to the Perspectives in History podcast. I'm your host, Willem Connor. Thank you for listening as always. This is part 8 of our series on the Iron Guard, entitled The Exiled and the Damned. I have a couple of housekeeping notes to go over at the top of the show. So, as I mentioned previously, this will be the final episode of our series on the Iron Guard. After this, the show will go on hiatus until September, as it usually does. I'm hoping to have my 4th Crusade script ready to produce by then, but we'll have to wait and see if that ends up happening. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns that you want for me to address during the hiatus, you can always get in touch with me via the show's email, perspectivesinhistorypod@gmail.com. Anyway, please stay tuned for the return of the show in a few months, and that should do it for now. Let's get into the narrative. In the previous episode of our series on the Iron Guard, we covered events from November 1940 to January 1941, primarily focusing our attention on the events of January 21st to January 23rd, the Legionary Rebellion and concurrent Bucharest pogrom. These events spelled the end of the National Legionary State, a coalition government of the Legion of the Archangel Michael, led by their commandant Horia Sima, and the Romanian military led by General Ion Antonescu. This political partnership was tenuous practically from the moment the regime was founded in September 1940. Disagreements arose between the two ostensible governing partners regarding their respective visions for Romanian society and the tactics they would use to realize them. Antonescu viewed the Legion as religious fanatics whose disregard for law and order would reduce the country to a state of anarchy. The Legionaries, on the other hand, saw Antonescu as a fundamentally reactionary figure, unwilling to go to the lengths necessary to renew the nation. As tension built steadily between these two increasingly irreconcilable factions that comprised the Romanian government, both sought to curry favor with Romania's new ally, the German Reich. The Germans had taken a keen interest in Romanian affairs in recent months as they began drawing up plans for a full-scale invasion of the Soviet Union. Romania factored into these plans as a crucial military and economic partner. Germany began stationing troops in the country as early as October 1940, with the approval of the Romanian government, of course. It was clear to both parties involved in the simmering conflict that German support would likely be the decisive factor when open hostilities arose. For Germany's Chancellor, Adolf Hitler, maintaining stability was the top priority vis-à-vis Romania. Hoping to avoid a civil war, he invited the leaders of the opposing factions to meet with him in person so that he could mediate their dispute. However, only General Antonescu accepted the invitation. The meeting between himself and Hitler on January 14th would prove decisive. The conducator swayed the Führer over to his point of view regarding the Legion, and the latter came away from the conference fully convinced that the former would be a more reliable ally to Germany than his rivals. Referring to the Legion as a group of fanatics, Hitler gave his tacit approval to his Romanian counterpart to expel them from the government. Returning to Romania with the full confidence of German support, Antonescu immediately acted against the Legion, removing Legion-affiliated ministers from their posts and openly denouncing Horia Sima, who he accused of having a, quote, anti-national attitude, end quote. All the while, Sima and his affiliates were actively preparing for an armed confrontation with the forces loyal to Antonescu, a confrontation they were supremely confident in their ability to win. The immediate catalyst for the rebellion was the assassination of a German military officer in Bucharest on January 20th. Both sides were quick to cast the blame on the other for failing to adequately protect their German allies. The Legion staged protests against the Antonescu government in major cities, while Antonescu used the assassination as a pretext by which to sack several more legionary ministers from their offices. Fighting broke out early the next day when the Legion occupied several key government buildings in the capital and refused entry to the new officials appointed by Antonescu to replace them. For the first 36 hours after armed conflict began, Antonescu held his forces back, ordering them to shoot only in self-defense. Essentially given free rein over the city, the fighters of the Legion carried out a savage pogrom against the Jewish population of Bucharest. All told, 125 Jews were murdered in the ensuing violence, and an untold number more were wounded, beaten, maimed, or otherwise brutalized. Over 1,000 buildings, including several synagogues, were destroyed or severely damaged, with the devastation being the worst in the Jewish-majority districts of Vacarești and Dudești. General Antonescu's decision to allow the legion to rampage through the capital had been carefully calculated. He knew exactly how they would conduct themselves in the absence of authority, given their recent track record of robbery, extortion, and murder. In this way, the legion would, through their own actions, demonstrate that they were unfit to govern the country. In other words, to quote the historian Nicholas Nagy Talavera, quote, "These 3 days were a closing chapter fitting to the National Legionary state. The Iron Guard could not muster more than it had, and what it had, a fanatic militancy at best and a sordid criminality at worst, was and had always been essentially mystical, unrealistic, and irresponsible." End quote. The conductors' gambit worked perfectly. The sheer brutality of the legion's actions during the rebellion and pogrom served to discredit them in the eyes of the Romanian public and, more importantly, to the Germans. By the second night of the chaos in Bucharest, Hitler was calling Antonescu personally, pleading with him to restore order. This he did without hesitation. The army units he had held in reserve up to that point sprung into action. The rebels, for all their religious fervor and suicidal bravery, hardly stood a chance against the tanks and heavy machine guns of the Romanian army. In the face of overwhelming force, Horia Sima issued an appeal to the legion to lay down their arms. Most rebels surrendered in a matter of hours, with only a few diehards continuing to put up resistance by midday on January 23rd. This brings us back to where we left off. The capital city remained on lockdown for days after hostilities concluded. General Antonescu announced that rebels had 24 hours to hand over their firearms, after which anyone found to be in possession of one would be considered an enemy combatant. Squadrons of soldiers and gendarmes fanned throughout the city, hunting for rebels. Searches of residences yielded over 5,000 guns and an incredible amount of luxury goods stolen during the pogrom, 200 truckloads worth, allegedly. In a journal entry dated January 25th, Romanian Jewish author Mihail Sebastian described the sense of relief felt by the citizens of Bucharest after the rebellion was quelled. Quote, "Troops and tanks are still patrolling the streets. The last building where the legionaries took shelter is being cleared out now. The city is absolutely dead after sundown. The theaters and restaurants are closed and no one is permitted to move around. During the day, though, people seem lively and talkative, especially in the morning. The streets are packed as though it was a public holiday. At the barber shop today, everyone was talking about what had happened in terms of approval, relief, and excitement. The owner of the shop, Mr. Costel, said that the army was more than a match for the occasion, and that those damned legionaries are a bunch of criminals." End quote. Sebastian's journal entry for the next day, describing the devastation of the Jewish quarter, paints a different picture entirely. Quote, "The greatest disaster was in Vacarești and Dudești. It looks like the aftermath of a great fire. Not one house, not one building escaped plundering and looting. I can only imagine what it looked like on Wednesday night. The entire district ablaze while gangs of brigands ran around terrorizing these poor people. Here and there, a few shops with Romanian names were left somewhat intact. But the Romanian shop notices placed on doors did not always stave off disaster. One can see quite a few gutted houses and shops, still with the signs that were supposed to protect them. Christian property, Romanian owner, etc. Today would be the 4th day since the cataclysm, so some of the damage may have been concealed or removed, but it is still an overwhelming sight. All of this devastation hit the poorest of the poor, already living in wretched conditions. Small-scale craftsmen and traders, humble, careworn people barely managing to eke out a living. Here and there, beside the ruins, one can see an old woman or a nearly naked child crying, waiting seemingly for nothing. In front of the morgue, hundreds of people wait in line. There are still so many people missing, and so many unidentified corpses. Today's newspaper is full of Jewish obituaries. The cemetery is full of fresh graves. The total number of dead is yet undetermined." End quote. In the days and weeks immediately following the rebellion, Antonescu seemingly still believed that cooperation with some subset of the Legion was possible, hence why he attempted to pin the blame for the rebellion on a cadre of supposed Jewish and communist infiltrators instead of squarely on the Legion, as we discussed in the previous episode. On January 23rd, he pledged to revitalize the National Legionary state through collaboration with the sections of the movement that had remained loyal to the regime. Now, there were a handful of legionaries who disavowed the rebellion and swore allegiance to the conductor, most notably Ion Zelea Codreanu and the factions surrounding him, but ultimately the subsection of legionaries who, A, were willing to publicly identify with the movement still, B, had not actively participated in the insurrection, and C, were open to working with Antonescu, was vanishingly small. Moreover, any cohesion the small group of moderates associated with the elder Codreanu was lost after he died of natural causes in November of that year. It was not long before Antonescu realized that any attempt to co-opt the Legionary movement, or rather what was left of it, was dead on arrival, and accordingly, on February 14th, he abolished the National Legionary State and outlawed the Iron Guard. Among other things, this ban made unauthorized gatherings and public displays of legionary iconography criminal offenses. Suffice it to say that the Conducator did not abide by his supposed promise not to prosecute the rebels. It's unclear to me whether he actually made this promise to begin with, or if it was a fabrication on the part of the German negotiators to persuade Sima to give up. Mass arrests of suspected legionaries began immediately after the ceasefire and continued until August of that year. Some 9,000 arrests took place in the first month alone, with half of those being in Bucharest. 1/6 of them, about 1,300 individuals, were released within a week. A similar number never faced trial, but remained in preventative custody until the trials concluded. The remaining 6,400 or so were tried by military tribunals in the following months. The first trials were conducted in February and March and involved only individuals accused of lesser crimes during the rebellion. Quite a few of the accused were not even affiliated with the Legion. Rather, they were simply opportunistic criminals who took advantage of the state of anarchy to enrich themselves at the expense of Bucharest's Jewish population. Nevertheless, the rulings were harsh and very few acquittals were issued. After the trials were concluded, Antonescu did make a gesture of benevolence to his vanquished rivals by granting amnesty to rebels whose sentences were 5 years or less. This gesture was an empty one, as the vast majority of sentences were greater than 5 years, and as such, the amnesty applied to a very small percentage of convicts. Moreover, it did not apply retroactively to the additional 4,000 people who would be convicted after the amnesty was put into effect. The most consequential trials took place in early June, the accused being split into two groups. The first group were those accused of having orchestrated and/or participated in the Jalava massacre of November 1940. The second group were those accused of leading the rebellion of January 1941. The former group was dealt with much more severely than the latter, as all 20 of the accused, including Dumitru Groza and Traian Boeru, the latter being the man responsible for the assassinations of Nicolae Iorga and Virgil Maghiaru, were sentenced to death. The second group, the heads of the legionary movement, at least those who were in state custody, we'll discuss those who weren't in a moment, were 16 in number. They included Radu Mironovici, one of the original founders of the movement, Stefan Zavoianu, the former police prefect of Bucharest, Constantin Petroviescu, former Minister of the Interior, Traian Bralianu, former Minister of Education, Petra Panaitescu, former Dean of the University of Bucharest, and Mihai Sturza, former Minister of Foreign Affairs. This round of trials, compared to the Jalava massacre trials, was more controversial at the time, likely because the guilt of Groza and his accomplices was beyond any doubt. In mid-May, during the run-up to the trial, law students at the University of Bucharest, sympathetic to the legions, staged a demonstration in support of the Guardist leaders, chanting "Long live Horia Sima" and singing legionary hymns. This spontaneous demonstration was immediately and forcefully broken up by the authorities. According to Nagi Talavera, it was the last major legionary demonstration in the country. From that moment onward, the movement was well and truly absent from the public sphere. The verdicts of the second round of trials were less severe, primarily because the worst offenders had already fled the country. Horia Sima and several others would be tried and convicted in absentia, with Sima being sentenced to death. Of the 16 who were present for trials, none received a death sentence. Only 2 received prison sentences longer than 10 years, 8 received sentences between 7 years to 6 months imprisonment, and the remaining 6 were acquitted. Overall, of the 6,400 legionaries tried after the rebellion, about 4,000 received prison sentences ranging from life to 6 months. Now, at this point, you may be curious as to what happened to Horia Sima and the other leading Guardists who were tried and convicted in absentia. To answer that question, we will have to briefly backtrack to the events of January 21st through the 23rd. As we covered in the last episode, Sima, who is a deeply suspicious man, went into hiding at the first sign of armed conflict, his location being known only to a handful of trusted individuals. One of these individuals was Otto von Bolschwing, an operative of the, and forgive my pronunciation here, Sicherheitsdienst, or the SD. which was an intelligence agency subordinate to the Schutzstaffel, or the SS. This is all a bit confusing, I know, but my point is that the SD, being part of the SS, was capable of acting independently of directives from other departments of the German government. So while Hitler, the Wehrmacht, and the German Foreign Office all unequivocally supported Antonescu, the SD was able to protect Sima and several other Gardist leaders in the wake of the Feld Rebellion. On the night of January 23rd, Sima and 12 other legionaries were escorted to the SD headquarters in Bucharest. The most significant figures in this group, aside from Sima, were Vasil Iașinci, former Minister of Labor, Cornelieu Georgescu, a founding member of the movement, Ilie Garniata, another founder of the movement, Constantin Papanas, former Undersecretary of Finance, Viorel Trifa, president of the Legionary Students' Association, and Traian Borobaru, Sima's personal secretary. These 13 fugitives hid in the basement of the SD headquarters for weeks. Since it was on the grounds of the German embassy, it could not be legally searched by Romanian authorities. German ambassador Manfred von Killinger, who had been instructed by Hitler to, quote, support Antonescu with all the means at his disposal, end quote, almost certainly suspected that the SD were sheltering the fugitives. He issued a warning to all German military and diplomatic officials to cease all contact with the rebels immediately, under threat of administrative reprimand. Disregarding this message, von Bolschwing arranged for the 13 legionaries he was sheltering to escape the country. Disguised as SS officers, Sima and company were spirited out of Romania aboard German military trains. Hitler was initially none too pleased with this subterfuge, as he was concerned that it would harm relations with his ally Antonescu. He saw to it that von Bolschwing was demoted and reassigned elsewhere, but he ultimately decided not to extradite the Gardists. He granted them asylum on the condition that they signed pledges to refrain from political activities or other attempts to influence Romania's internal affairs. The same terms were extended to hundreds more legionaries who managed to escape to German territory, with assistance from the SS and SD following the rebellion. Legionaries of lower rank were given living accommodations in the city of Rostock on Germany's northern coast. This group started at 60 individuals as of April 1941 and expanded to between 240 and 400 over the next year as more and more émigrés arrived. Most were given jobs at the factory of the aircraft manufacturer Heinkel, and they were paid a decent wage for their labor. As for Sima and the other leaders of the movement, they were initially allowed to reside in Berlin, where they were allowed a significant degree of freedom of movement. The commandant appears to have mistaken the German government's toleration of his presence for their support. In March, Sima wrote a letter to General Antonescu, indicating that he was open to reconciliation and suggesting that such a development would be welcomed by their mutual friends in the German government. The conjugator, who was actively suppressing the remnants of the legionary movement at that time, saw no reason to consider this offer, and he rebuffed Sima in strong terms. Now aware of Sima's presence in Berlin, Antonescu requested that Hitler extradite him and his accomplices to Romania to face justice. Hoping to preempt this, Sima wrote a lengthy memorandum to the Führer, attempting to justify his actions and requesting permission to resume political activities. This message was received rather poorly. Hitler was already negatively disposed towards Sima due to the latter's refusal to participate in the proposed summit back in January. He upbraided the commandant for his insolence and threatened to hand him over to Antonescu if he tried anything of this sort again. As a consequence of this unauthorized communication with the Chancellery, Sima and the other exiled Gardist leaders were no longer permitted to live in Berlin. They were relocated to a villa about 30 miles outside the city in the town of Birkenbruck, where they were kept under house arrest. This raises the question, why did Hitler not simply deport Sima and company? The answer is simply that he believed that he still had some use for these émigrés. While it is true that Hitler held Antonescu in higher regard than any of his other allied heads of state, save for perhaps Mussolini, he nonetheless thought it prudent to preserve the Iron Guard in some form as a sort of insurance policy against Antonescu, a threat constantly hanging over him to ensure his compliance should he ever step out of line. It is difficult for us to say how effective this threat was because, ironically, by the time the Germans actually had cause to carry through with this threat, Antonescu was already out of the picture, but I'm getting ahead of myself. On June 22, 1941, General Antonescu issued a proclamation announcing that Romania had joined the German Reich in its invasion of the Soviet Union, referring to this endeavor as a holy war against the forces of Judeo-Bolshevism. This event, the commencement of Operation Barbarossa, is of course one of the most consequential events in modern history. The future of Eastern Europe and that of the world was more uncertain than ever. This holds true for the subjects of our narrative as well, the remaining members of the Legion of the Archangel Michael, both those who were still in Romania and those who were outside of it. To begin with, it bears mentioning that there was overwhelming support for the war among the Legionaries. Antonescu's rhetoric about the crusade to liberate Romanian territory from the communist menace was practically indistinguishable from what a young Cornelieu Codreanu was saying in 1918. Swept up in this tide of nationalist fervor, they were willing to set aside their differences with Antonescu and his regime for the time being. Speaking for those still imprisoned in the country at the time, Mihai Sturza later stated, quote, "Despite our very justifiable resentment against the general, we, from the moment Romania entered the war, scrupulously avoided creating any difficulties for his government." End quote. A week after war was declared, Antonescu received a letter co-signed by 40 legionary prisoners, including Sturza, asking for permission to fight on the front lines. He was resistant to the idea at first, as he did not want his enemies to receive any of the martial glory that he felt was his alone. By that same token, he was not above having them do his dirty work. The dirty work in question, liquidating the Jewish population of Moldavia. As I've made a point to emphasize throughout these past few episodes, Antonescu was every bit as anti-Semitic as his political rivals. Resolving the so-called Jewish question remained a top priority for his government, even after the Iron Guard was ousted from the coalition. If anything, Antonescu's pursuit of Romanianization only intensified, especially as the prospect of war became more concrete. In the past, Antonescu had insisted on dealing with the Jews in an orderly, methodical fashion, preferring legislation to terror as his instrument of choice. Once preparations for the war began, the Jewish problem took on a military significance, requiring more forceful measures to be enacted. The existence of a sizable Jewish population in Moldavia, most of whom, about 50,000, lived in Iași and its vicinity, was especially worrisome to military officials, given the proximity of the region to the Soviet border. Since Judaism and communism were one and the same in the ultranationalists' imagination, they worried that the Jews living in Moldavia would act as a fifth column and undermine the Romanian war effort. In mid-June, a few days before the commencement of Operation Barbarossa, Antonescu sent a missive to the Ministry of the Interior, stating, quote, "All the Judeo-communist coffee shops in Moldavia should be closed down. All Yids, communist agents, and sympathizers should be identified. The ministry must know who they are, forbid them to travel, and be prepared to do whatever I shall order at the appropriate moment." End quote. Section 2 of the Army's Supreme Headquarters and the Special Information Service, or SSI, as Romania's secret police organization was called, were tasked, at least officially, with, quote, "defending the front from espionage, sabotage, and terrorism from behind the lines," end quote. Their true directive, according to SSI Lieutenant Traian Boroescu, was, quote, "to do away with the Moldavian Jews by deportation or extermination," end quote. On June 22nd, the day that military operations against the USSR commenced, SSI operatives released a number of legionaries from Iași's prison. Eyewitnesses reported seeing these officers issue instructions of some kind to the newly freed legionaries. 2 days later, the Soviet Air Force carried out a bombing raid on Iași. It resulted in minimal damage, but nonetheless provoked a hysterical reaction among the non-Jewish population. At the direction of their SSI handlers, the legionaries spread rumors that the Jews within the city were transmitting signals to guide the Soviet bombers. A second air raid on the 26th was significantly more destructive, hitting the headquarters of the 14th Infantry Division and killing at least 100 people. Anti-Jewish panic reached a fever pitch. The rumors started 2 days prior were exaggerated even further. It was now said that the Jews of Iași were all Communist Party members who took their orders directly from Moscow. This type of hearsay even made it into official military dispatches, one of which claimed that the Jews were aiding and abetting Soviet paratroopers. According to the testimony of Colonel Constantin Lupu, the commander of the Iași garrison, early the next day, June 27th, he received reports of an illegal gathering of armed legionaries near the Jewish cemetery. He took a platoon of soldiers and went to the scene, but was persuaded to not disarm the men by 2 SSI officers, who showed him orders from the Army's Supreme Headquarters to arm the legionaries for a special operation. The nature of this special operation was made apparent the next day. On the morning of June 28th, Iași police began rounding up the city's Jewish population en masse. What ensued was, in many respects, a repeat of the Bucharest pogrom, albeit better organized and on a much larger scale. Legionaries once again played a central role in the violence, with the crucial difference here being that they were deputized by the authorities to help them carry it out. Italian diplomat and war correspondent Curzio Malaparte wrote a first-hand account of the Iași pogrom, which I will now read an excerpt from. Quote, "Hordes of Jews pursued by soldiers and maddened civilians armed with butcher knives and crowbars fled along the streets. Policemen went from house to house, smashing in doors and windows with the butts of their rifles. Upper-story windows opened suddenly and screaming disheveled women in nightgowns appeared. Some threw themselves from the building, and their faces hit the asphalt with a dull thud. Soldiers lobbed hand grenades through the windows at street level into the cellars where many people sought safety in vain. Some dropped to their knees to observe the results of the explosions and turned their laughing faces towards their comrades. In the places where the slaughter had been heaviest, the ground was slick with blood. Everywhere the hysterical and ferocious toll of the pogrom filled the city with the sounds of gunfire, explosions, and terrible screaming and cruel laughter." End quote. An official government communique reporting these events stated that, quote, 5,000 Judeo-Freemasons were executed, end quote. In reality, that was understating the case. The death toll of the Iași pogrom was in excess of 13,000. This was only the beginning of the genocidal campaign enacted by Antonescu's regime against the Jewish population in Romania and its occupied territories, in which 300,000 Jews, about half the pre-war Jewish population, were killed. But all of that is a story for another time. To return to the war against the USSR, Romanian forces were, with German assistance, able to completely retake the territories previously annexed by the Soviets within the first month of combat operations. Although this represented the fulfillment of Romania's stated war aims, Antonescu committed the Romanian army to continue fighting on the Eastern Front. They advanced alongside the Germans deep into Ukraine and all the way to Stalingrad. This controversial decision forced Antonescu to reconsider his stance on allowing legionary prisoners to join the army. When one of his generals raised the question to him again in October 1941, Antonescu replied, quote, "Some of them were upright people. Those who can be trusted to behave properly should be given the chance to redeem themselves, and also can be used by the army." End quote. On April 26, 1942, the Romanian Army's Chief of Staff issued an order permitting political prisoners to be organized into special battalions and sent to the front. According to historian Ilarion II, approximately 1,300 political detainees chose to enlist in the army between April 1942 and February 1943, enough manpower to form 3 battalions, designated Special Battalions 991, 992, and 994. All of these were assigned to the 5th Infantry Division, which itself was deployed in southern Russia during the defense of the Kuban bridgehead. They were kept under close surveillance and not allowed to be promoted or decorated, but nonetheless, their commanding officers reported that they performed up to standard. In particular, these reports praised their morale in comparison to other units. After the Romanian army was all but destroyed in the Battle of Stalingrad, which concluded in February 1943, the legionaries' faith in the Axis cause was shaken. Enlistments from the prisons halted entirely, as no one wanted to sign up to become another casualty statistic. Those who were already deployed on the front apparently honored their commitments and refused to desert, with some remaining in active duty well into 1944. A similar dynamic played out with the exiled legionaries when the war in the East began. The Gardist leaders being held under semi-house arrest in Birkenbruck wrote to Adolf Hitler in June 1941, this time making sure to use the proper channels, requesting permission to fight on the front lines, specifically asking to enlist in the German army rather than the Romanian army, assuming that the Germans might be more favorable to their request if it was less likely to harm their relationship with the Romanian government. The request was denied all the same, again supposedly on account of Hitler's antipathy towards Horia Sima. As a consequence, security at Birkenbruck was tightened. The legionaries were no longer permitted to come and go without prior approval from their Gestapo handlers. It was also at this time that the Germans began looking for ways to challenge Sima's leadership of the organization in the hopes of replacing him with somebody more agreeable. They approached other exiled Gardist leaders and encouraged them to voice their grievances with Sima. The first major figure to do so was Constantin Papanas, a senior legionary who had served as the Undersecretary of Finance during the National Legionary State. Papanas, who was of a more liberal disposition than Sima, had long harbored a grudge against him, but, up to this point, he had tried to keep the peace for the good of the movement. Now, in the summer of 1941, Papanas criticized Sima openly, calling him, quote, a terrorist who abused his connections to attain power, end quote. He further accused him of lacking discipline, maturity, and a strong vision, and blamed him for the events that led to their defeat in the first place. Surely enough, dissent emerged from elsewhere within the ranks, and by 1942, the legionary exiles in Germany had split into 4 different factions, only one of which recognized Sima as the legitimate leader of the group. These disputes eventually became so contentious that one group of legionary exiles conspired to have Sima assassinated. Their plot was uncovered by the German authorities, and the principal conspirators were arrested. A subsequent investigation into the matter, conducted by the Gestapo, concluded without any criminal charges being brought against the accused plotters. Now, Sima had gradually come to the conclusion that the Legion's relationship with the German government was no longer mutually beneficial. He had begun searching for a new foreign sponsor. The apathetic response of the authorities to the foiled assassination plot was used by Sima as a pretext to justify his later actions. In late 1942, just after the conspiracy was uncovered, Sima escaped house arrest and flew to Rome, where he hoped to secure an audience with Italian Prime Minister Benito Mussolini. Sima's mission was an abysmal failure, as he not only failed to establish contact with Mussolini, but was arrested by Italian police and promptly extradited back to Germany. Antonescu was furious when he heard about Sima's latest stunt. He reiterated his demand to German officials to take more stringent measures against him and his accomplices, this time threatening to withdraw some, or potentially all of his forces from the Eastern Front if they did not. They obliged and immediately had all known legionary émigrés in Germany, meaning both the cadre of leaders at Birkenbruck and the lower-ranking men at Rostock, relocated to the Buchenwald concentration camp. Conditions there were, as one can imagine, worse than what they had grown accustomed to. Freedom of movement was entirely non-existent, and they were all kept under close watch. That said, they were treated far more humanely than the average inmates at the camp, as they were not intentionally starved, forced to work until they died of exhaustion, or subjected to arbitrary execution. They were held in a separate section of the camp, apart from the rest of the prisoners, and while they were compelled to do menial labor in support of the German war effort, they were at least paid a meager wage for their work. The higher-ranking guardists had even more comfortable accommodations, with historian Ilarion II describing the conditions of their detention as being more similar to a bed and breakfast than a Nazi concentration camp. The legionaries interred at Buchenwald also had certain privileges not afforded to most inmates, most notably the ability to read outside books and newspapers and to listen to the radio. In this way, they were able to stay informed on the latest developments out of their home country. That being said, they were prohibited from communicating with the outside, to say nothing of engaging in political activity. Overall, their day-to-day existence in the camp was characterized by drudgery with no foreseeable end. An official from the Foreign Office assigned as the legionaries' handler visited the leaders exactly once, in November 1943, when he told them bluntly that their future depended on 2 questions. Firstly, what course events in Romania would take, and secondly, if and when the Foreign Office believed they might have use for them. Both of these questions would be answered in August 1944. By that point in time, the course of the war had turned decisively against the Axis powers. After being defeated in the Battle of Stalingrad, in which Romanian forces suffered between 100,000 and 200,000 casualties, the armies of the Axis powers were being pushed back steadily all across the Eastern Front. All of Romania's territorial gains since Operation Barbarossa had been reversed by April 1944. In August, a renewed Soviet offensive broke through Axis lines and onto the territory of Romania proper. It was in this context that, on the 23rd of that month, King Michael I, with support from a broad coalition of opposition parties, staged a coup d'etat against General Antonescu. The new government promptly concluded an armistice with the Allied powers and declared war on the German Reich. Romania's armed forces fully committed themselves to the Allied war efforts, turning their guns against their erstwhile allies. The Axis forces within the country were encircled, and the German Sixth Army was completely destroyed. Germany's ambassador to Romania, Manfred von Killinger, went completely mad. Fearing either punishment by his superiors in Berlin for having given them false reassurances about Romania's loyalty, or, more realistically, being captured by the Red Army, Killinger shot his secretary, with whom it was rumored he was having an affair, and then himself. The German Air Force bombed Bucharest in retaliation, specifically targeting the royal palace, and while they succeeded in doing considerable damage to it, the king, who had already evacuated the premises, was unharmed. While the German military seems to have been caught completely off guard by this dramatic turn of events, the Foreign Office in Berlin evidently was not. Ever since the events of January 1941, they had intentionally kept Horia Sima and his comrades in the dark, condemned to political irrelevance. The commandant himself had spent the last year and a half confined to a prison cell in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, having been separated from the larger group of émigrés in order to deter him from hatching any new schemes. The moment that a hostile government was installed in Bucharest, however, they did not hesitate to bring the Legion out of stasis. News of the coup had hardly broken when Sima was approached by representatives from the Foreign Ministry, who asked if he would be willing to help establish a Romanian government in exile. He jumped at the opportunity, and after extracting from him a pledge of loyalty to the Reich, Sima was taken to Vienna to meet with Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop. He had one request of him at this time. He wanted him to issue a manifesto to the Romanian people, calling on them to continue fighting alongside the Axis against their true enemy, the Judeo-Bolshevik menace. Sima quickly drafted the manifesto and presented it to the foreign minister, who approved it without modification. It was broadcast in full the next day on Radio Donau, a propaganda outlet based in Vienna. I've been unable to find a transcript of this statement or any of the subsequent ones that would also be broadcast from the station by legionary émigrés in the following months, but I think a passage from Mihai Sturza's memoir covering this period should give us an idea of what this message was. For context, by this time, Sturza had escaped custody in Romania and joined the group of émigrés in Germany. Anyway, Sturza writes, quote, "As for us in Vienna, by December 1944, we considered the king and all those who surrounded him as prisoners of the armed forces of an enemy government. Therefore, we maintained that Romania had neither king nor government, and that the individuals who appeared in the successive ministerial formations were, some of them, outright communist agents, others, simply terrified or incompetent Romanians who were functioning in the positions they occupied under the threat of torture. Facing a situation without precedent in Romanian history, we decided that it was our patriotic duty, as free Romanians, to attempt what our enslaved countrymen would want us to do, to raise again the standard their inept and terrorized leaders had dropped at the enemy's first bidding." End quote. Shortly after Sima's manifesto was broadcast, he was taken to Budapest, where he would be briefed by General Artur Fleps, a Romanian-born officer in the Waffen-SS, about Germany's plans and where he factored into them. Sima was to establish a rival government in the city of Arad, a city in the extreme western part of Romania that was still controlled by Axis forces for the time being. Directly contesting the legitimacy of the government currently in Bucharest, this government headed by Sima would have two primary directives: to coordinate resistance efforts of legionary personnel inside Romania, and to organize Romanian volunteers within Axis-held territory into a national army that would continue to fight alongside the Axis powers. Sima promised that he would be able to deliver on these objectives, but, if anything, the willingness of the German military to accept his claims at face value only demonstrated how desperate they were to turn things around. For one, the Legion was simply not a significant force in Romania and had not been so for nearly 4 years. Sima claimed that he would be able to raise an insurgent force between 60 and 80,000 strong within Romanian territory, a claim that was absurd on its face. There were still a handful of clandestine cells that continued to operate in the country, but Sima's contact with them had been minimal even before he was interned in Sachsenhausen, after which it ceased entirely. The idea that he would be able to not only reopen communication with them and be able to coordinate their activities to any effect in such a short amount of time was not realistic. Nor was the idea that this government would be capable of mobilizing a combat-ready force of any appreciable size under the current circumstances. Supposedly, they hoped to form at least 2 divisions, that is to say, approximately 30,000 men. It should be remembered that there were only about 400 legionaries in Germany at that time. They perhaps hoped to recruit the remaining manpower from other Romanian refugees, but the process of recruitment and training was certain to take a lot of time, which they simply did not have. Finally, this entire plan was contingent on the Axis forces being able to hold the front line in the Carpathian Mountains, which appeared ever more doubtful by the day. Romanian and Soviet troops were quickly advancing westward and would soon reach the Romanian-Hungarian border. General Fleps, who had been tasked with the defense of southern Transylvania and the Banat, was a general without an army. His superiors in Berlin had effectively told him that he was on his own. They could not spare the reinforcements. A short time after meeting with Sima, Fleps was captured by Soviet troops outside Arad and subsequently killed during a botched escape attempt. With the impending collapse of the front in the Carpathians, the plan to establish a government in Arad was abandoned. Sima was subsequently relocated to Vienna, where the German Foreign Office had already taken most of the other legionaries who remained within the Reich. And now, a word from our sponsor. And now, back to the show. The German government gathered the legionary exiles in Vienna for the same purpose, the establishment of a government in exile. This, however, was easier said than done. Despite all the trouble that he'd caused them in the past, the Germans backed Sima for the premiership of the new government, and at no point considered anyone else for the role. Their stance does make sense insofar as Sima was still the nominal leader of the movement, and was still able to command the loyalty of a slim majority of the legionaries in Germany, as well as a number of non-legionary Romanian emigres. However, support for Sima was by no means unanimous. As you'll recall, challenges to Sima's leadership had emerged as early as June 1941. This dissent had only intensified in the time since. As one can imagine, not too many legionaries were pleased about having been forced to spend the last several months in a concentration camp due to Sima's reckless actions. Initial negotiations took place in September, and did not get off to a promising start. Sima planned to issue an appeal to all legionaries to look past their disagreements and work together in light of the dire situation. This message did not reach its intended targets. All 350 legionaries present in Vienna were invited to this first meeting on September 6th, including Sima's outspoken opponents. Only 170, about half, actually attended. In retaliation, Sima completely reorganized the movement's leadership structure, effectively purging his rivals. Meanwhile, the German Foreign Ministry sent two officials to Vienna, Gunther Altenburg and Ernst Gemmelscheg, tasking them with overseeing the creation of the Romanian government in exile. They spent the next few weeks meeting with the dissident legionaries, hoping to determine under what conditions they would agree to cooperate with Sima. Constantin Papanas, the de facto leader of the dissidents, argued that if this government was to have even the patina of legitimacy, it could not be seen as the sole initiative of the legionary movement. It had to be inclusive of all anti-communist Romanians, and as such, it would be a mistake to appoint Sima as the chief executive. It would be more appropriate, Papanas argued, to find a more neutral figure, ideally someone from the military or the clergy. The meeting concluded on a contentious note, with Papanas declaring outright that he and his faction would not participate in this project if the Germans insisted on keeping Sima at its head. The Germans retorted with a threat of their own, warning the dissidents that if they were not going to collaborate with Germany's collaborators, they were, of course, against Germany, and that things would not end well for them. Surely enough, 2 days after this meeting, Papanas and his supporters were evicted from the hotel that the German government had provided for accommodations, and their ration cards were revoked. A few nights sleeping on park benches with no food were sufficient to make them return to the negotiating table. Another meeting of the legionary leadership was held on October 17th, and although the dissidents were actually in attendance this time, this round of talks did not bring the two sides any closer to an agreement. When this meeting ended inconclusively as well, the Germans, at Sima's instigation, threatened once again to put the dissidents out onto the streets. Once again, they agreed to reconsider their stance, only to end up quarreling with Sima and his faction over the finer details and eventually walking out again. This cycle repeated itself multiple times, delaying the proceedings for months. It was not until December 10th, 1944, that the Romanian national government in Vienna was formally established. This was over 4 months after German state radio had proclaimed the existence of this government in the days immediately following the coup d'etat. The military situation on the Eastern Front had worsened drastically in the intervening period. By the end of the year, Soviet and Romanian forces were laying siege to Budapest, while Vienna was being subjected to Allied bombing raids on a daily basis. These circumstances precluded the Vienna government from any meaningful activity. The organization was ultimately inconsequential and short-lived, really more of a bit of trivia than anything else. Most sources covering Romania's involvement in World War II omit any mention of it entirely, and understandably so. This government, which claimed to represent the interest of patriotic Romanians, as Nagy Talavera pointedly remarked, never controlled so much as a single square inch of Romanian territory. organizing armed resistance within Romania itself, while not feasible to begin with, was now deemed entirely impractical given its distance from the front lines. Sturza, who reprised his role as foreign minister in the Vienna government, later claimed that the project of raising divisions of Romanian volunteers to fight for the Axis had continued throughout this time, and that one division actually did see action in the Pomerania region of northern Germany in the final days of the war. He blamed the cowardice of Wehrmacht generals for the failure to train and deploy additional volunteer units. I should note that while other sources do attest to the fact that approximately 12,000 men were recruited for this project, Sturza's claim that any of these men ever saw combat remains unverified. As far as I have been able to tell, the only activity of any note that the Vienna government engaged in was broadcasting increasingly desperate and frantic incitements to the Romanian troops spearheading the Allied advance in the east to turn around and overthrow their traitorous king. It made no difference. By March 16th, Soviet troops reached the outskirts of Vienna, and the Romanian national government was evacuated to Ousted, a small town in the western half of Austria. After the fall of Vienna a month later, the Legionaries, fearing capture by the Communists, abruptly fled westward towards American and British lines. Splitting off in all directions, their only priority being survival, their government was left defunct. All told, it was, as Nagy Talavera summarized, a, quote, brief and shameful epilogue to their time in power, end quote. That same month, March 1945, a communist-led government was established in Romania with the assistance of Soviet occupation forces. The war in Europe came to a close a short time later with Germany's surrender on May 9th. One of the top priorities of the new Romanian government following the war's conclusion was prosecuting officials of the Antonescu regime for war crimes. The most significant of these trials was, of course, that of the conductor himself, whose rap sheet included, and I'm paraphrasing the indictment here, quote, the betrayal of the Romanian people for the benefit of Nazi Germany, affecting the economic and political subjugation of Romania to Nazi Germany, collaboration with the Iron Guard, the murder of political opponents, the mass murder of civilians, and crimes against peace, end quote. He was found guilty of all charges and executed by firing squad on June 1st, 1946. The post-war Romanian People's Tribunals only issued the death penalty to 13 war criminals, of whom only 4 were actually executed. 3 of these sentences were commuted, and the remaining 6 were issued in absentia. The scope of the tribunals was not limited to functionaries of the Antonescu government. The Legionary movement was, despite its antagonistic relationship toward the previous regime, not in any way exempted from prosecution. War crimes and/or crimes against peace represented one of the 2 categories of offenses outlined by Law No. 312, issued by King Michael in April 1945. The other category that the People's Tribunals were responsible for bringing to justice were, quote, culprits in the country's disaster, including those who, a, promoted the advance of fascism or Nazism, and having an effective political responsibility allowed the advance of German forces into the country, and b, after September 6, 1940, acted for the preparation and carrying out of the above deeds by word or any other means, end quote. It is clear from the wording of this law that the authors intended to make certain the tribunals could indict former members of the Iron Guard, even if it was not a top priority for them. According to a dossier from the year 1947, the Ministry of the Interior purportedly identified 48,000 members of the Legionary movement within Romania's borders, 12,500 of whom were considered active members. The accuracy of these figures is questionable, but if we are to take them at face value, then why was it that only a handful of legionaries, current or former, were ever brought to trial before the tribunals were formally dissolved in June 1946? And why was it that the limited number of Gardists who were prosecuted were those either already in state custody or living in exile? To be fair, the tribunals did issue harsh sentences in those cases they chose to pursue. Each of the 6 defendants condemned to death in absentia were legionaries, namely Horia Sima and other individuals who participated in the Vienna government. Still, one is left to ask why the communist government was so lenient with the thousands of suspected legionaries and sympathizers still at large in the country. In a way, this was reflective of a broader trend in Romania in the post-war years, as later historians have pointed out the fact that Romania, for lack of a better phrase, went easy on its fascist war criminals, especially compared to other Eastern European countries like Hungary or Bulgaria. The reasons for this are complex and varied, and not really relevant to this discussion. But, in the case of the Legion, there is a relatively straightforward explanation. See, unlike the other opposition parties that helped depose Antonescu, the Legion did not regain legal status after the coup d'etat. The organization was, officially speaking, still outlawed, but unofficially, there was a truce in effect between the Legionary movement and the communist authorities that began in 1945. In the final months of the war in Europe, a group of legionaries of indeterminate size were able to infiltrate Romania by parachute with German assistance. This group was led by Nicolae Petrescu, Horia Sima's second-in-command at the time of the 1941 rebellion. Their orders were to stage an armed uprising against the communist government, but after they found themselves stranded in the country following Germany's surrender, Petrescu was forced to reassess the situation. He concluded that it was necessary for the movement's survival to reach some kind of understanding with the communists, even if it was only a temporary one. Teohari Georgescu, the somewhat unscrupulous interior minister of Petru Groza's cabinet, was open to the idea of a truce with the legionary movement. The communists were still in the process of consolidating power, and such an arrangement would enable them to refocus their attention towards the other political parties that represented more significant obstacles to their rule. Pursuant to the agreement worked out between Petrescu and Georgescu, on August 6, 1945, Petrescu issued a circular to members of the legionary movement within Romania, urging them to cease armed resistance against the state for the good of the nation. For the most part, legionaries still in the country adhered to the truce. The neutrality agreement remained in effect until early 1947, that is to say, well after the People's Tribunals were dissolved in June 1946. Therefore, I think we can conclude that the reason why the tribunals dealt with the Iron Guard in the particular way that they did was to send a message to legionaries both inside and outside the country, while still honoring the terms of the Non-Aggression Pact. In a biography of Nicolae Ceausescu, who led Romania from 1965 to 1989, American journalist Edward Baer wrote at some length about this secret agreement between the communists and the legionary movement. He alleged that the proposed amnesty was extended directly to legionaries living abroad, specifically those in displaced person camps in Germany and Austria. As he tells it, all legionaries aside from those directly accused of murder or serious war crimes would be granted immunity from prosecution and allowed to return. In exchange, returning guardists were expected to join the Communist Party and were recruited to enact violence against the party's political opponents. Baer claims that hundreds, if not thousands, of former legionaries returned to Romania between 1945 and 1947, and dutifully fulfilled their end of the bargain only to be double-crossed by the communists once they had managed to consolidate power. I find Baer's version of events difficult to believe for a few reasons, one of which being that he is simply not a reliable author, but while other historians do attest to the non-aggression pact made between Petrescu and Interior Minister Georgescu, in Baer's telling, the agreement was made between Foreign Minister Anna Palker and 3 unnamed Iron Guard leaders in Vienna in mid-1946. However, any Guardists with enough authority within the movement to authorize such a consequential agreement had long since fled Vienna, and moreover, the fact that Baer places the responsibility on Palker should not be overlooked. Palker was a divisive figure within the Communist Party on account of her gender and her heritage. She was purged from the party in 1953 and subsequently used by her former comrades as a scapegoat for all the excesses of the Stalinist era. Therefore, sensational claims about Palker should be regarded with some amount of skepticism. The idea that Palker, a Jewish woman, would be so open to working with the Iron Guard is difficult to believe. Conversely, I do not think that legionaries living in exile would be at all inclined to trust her or the government that she spoke for. It is true that a significant number of former legionaries joined the Communist Party, but for the most part, these individuals were still in Romania immediately after the war, and their decision to change allegiances came from a place of pure desperation. They collaborated with the communists to protect themselves and their families. Legionaries already living in exile were generally quite disinclined to return. as they assumed, correctly, that they faced imprisonment by the communist authorities. Those few that did so with the intention to wage armed resistance, fully aware of the risks, as was the case with Nicolae Petrescu and his comrades. In any case, the truce between the government and the legionary movement was not fated to last indefinitely. The former had always regarded it as a temporary measure. A general election was held in November 1946, resulting in an overwhelming victory for the Communist Party. Although the legitimacy of the election results was questionable, the Communists nonetheless felt that their hold on power was far more secure, and accordingly, the Interior Ministry initiated a renewed crackdown against subversive political elements in February 1947, rendering the neutrality agreement with the Legion effectively void. Arrests of suspected legionaries began immediately, greatly intensifying after the abdication of King Michael I at the end of that year, and the subsequent proclamation of the Romanian People's Republic. With the final steps in the communist takeover accomplished, the new regime now set about completely dismantling the old order. One way in which they sought to further this aim was through the re-education of their political opponents. The government organization responsible for this was the Department of State Security, better known as the Securitate, established in 1948 along the lines of the Soviet NKVD. Former legionaries were the primary targets of these re-education efforts. The approach taken by the Securitate varied considerably from prison to prison. In certain facilities, namely Pitești and Gherla, physical torture and humiliation were the order of the day. Ironically, this ultimately redounded to the communists' detriment, as the victims of such treatment were later championed as heroes by right-wing groups in Romania. In other prisons where treatment was more humane, the re-education program met with a greater degree of success, as demonstrated by a plethora of statements authored by former legionaries formally disavowing the movement. A prisoner with Guardist ties was required to produce such a statement in order to be legally rehabilitated. More importantly for the Securitate, could be utilized as pedagogical materials for future re-education efforts. Historian Constantin Iordachi cites one work in particular as being emblematic of this genre, published in a brochure for the purpose of re-education. Authored by three former legionaries, Vasiliu Constantin, Constantin Grigoriu, and Dumitru Popovici, this pamphlet was written, according to the authors, for the explicit purpose of helping others like themselves recognize the error of their ways, to, quote, explicate the reactionary and criminal nature of the Legion, and in recognition of the imperative need to pull us out of the clutches of this monstrosity and take a stand against it, to renew and purify our consciousness, a sustained effort in the work of building a new society, end quote. One should not take all of the claims made in this document at face value, given the context of its creation, but all the same, I think the authors still offer some valuable insight as to the psychology of those who once truly believed in the legionary cause. Most interesting to me is their explanation of the religious aspect of the Legion's ideology. Quote, we all simultaneously believed in the singular genius of Codreanu's teachings and in the universality of Christian teachings. We combined the two, amplifying our faith but losing touch with reality. Our reasoning was hampered. We became miserable people, easy to manipulate. In the process, we fabricated illusory arguments to justify our diversion. It seemed to us at the time that we were completely in the right. We did not realize that both faith in Jesus Christ and faith in Codreanu were in reverse proportion to reason. In other words, the greater we believed in the two, the more we extinguished the flame of reason. Legionarism, in its criminal outburst, deformed Christianity, forging genuine blasphemies and departing fragrantly from Christian ethics. If, by some absurdity, Legionarism had lasted 1,000 years, it would surely have reached the point of seeing Codreanu as the only begotten Son of God, born of the Virgin, crucified and resurrected from the dead, and so on. End quote. For individuals with prior involvement in the Iron Guard, collaboration with the Communist Party was the only legal way to regain one's civil and political rights, but it was by no means the only option for survival. Many others chose the path of resistance. Beginning in 1947, isolated cells of partisans, typically numbering between 10 and 30 individuals, started waging a low-intensity war against the communist authorities in the countryside. These partisans had no central command structure or even a unifying ideology. A 1951 report by the Securitate concerning the backgrounds of captured insurgents showed that of 800 detainees, only 300 or so claimed any prior political affiliation. 80 of them, approximately 10% of the group as a whole, considered themselves either current or former members of the Legionary movement. While the Iron Guard was by no means overrepresented in the ranks of the anti-communist resistance in Romania, many of the most successful and longest-lived partisan groups were led by former Guardists. The Legion's long history of clandestine resistance during phases of political persecution meant that its former members were already well-equipped to resist the communist authorities. A notable example was Leon Schuschmann and his band of partisans. A member of the Iron Guard who was sentenced to 10 years in prison for his role in the 1941 rebellion, Schuschmann successfully evaded capture for years. He received a pardon in 1945 as part of the truce agreement, but was forced into hiding once again in 1947, this time heading deep into the Apuseni Mountains in central Transylvania. Schuschmann's group were the most active partisans in the region. It was not until 1957 that the security forces finally managed to take them down. More famous, or perhaps infamous, was Ion Gavrila Ogaranu. Once a member of the Iron Guard's youth organization, Ogaranu was only 19 years old when he participated in the Legionary Rebellion, for which he spent 3 years in prison. He attended university at Cluj for a time after his release, but there his past affiliation with the Legion and his outspoken opposition to communism inevitably led to problems with the authorities. In 1948, Ogaranu retreated into the Fagrash Mountains, becoming the leader of a band of partisans which historian Andrei Miroiu referred to as, quote, the most stern, violent, and courageous anti-communist partisans in Romania, end quote. For 7 years, Ogaranu and his band of partisans successfully thwarted numerous attacks by the security forces. Their band was eventually defeated in 1955, with all of its members either killed or captured, save for Ogaranu. What cemented his legacy as a symbol of resistance against the communist regime was the fact that he continued to evade the authorities for another 22 years. A controversial aspect of anti-communist resistance in Romania, but one that I would be remiss not to mention, is the involvement of Western intelligence, specifically the American Central Intelligence Agency. Declassified documents of the CIA and its predecessor organization, the OSS, attest to the fact that the Iron Guard were being monitored by American intelligence as early as 1945. Since Romania fell on the eastern side of the Iron Curtain, the CIA saw the Iron Guard as potential assets in their Cold War against the Communist bloc. Their fascist belief and prior collaboration with the Nazis was not regarded as compromising. If anything, it only further recommended them to their service. A CIA report, presumably written sometime between 1947 and 1949, states this more or less outright. Quote, without discussing the mistakes of the past, it is certain that today these people are animated with the unconditional desire to fight. They desire to redeem themselves through sacrifice, to play the most dangerous role there is to play. Moreover, their experience in clandestine fighting and technical underground activities should not be understated. It is like a second nature to them. In the eventuality of war against the USSR, they would be of great use to us in waging clandestine and guerrilla warfare behind enemy lines. End quote. The willingness to let bygones be bygones was mutual. The Legion's attitude towards the Western Allies had historically been less than positive, and although they had just until very recently been on opposing sides of the most bitter and destructive conflict in modern history, once the battle lines of Europe were redrawn after 1945, the remnants of the Legionary movement had few qualms realigning themselves with the West in opposition to the communist bloc. In the final chapter of his 1968 memoir, Mihai Sturza summarized the movement's outlook thusly, quote, only a mass upheaval in Romania could offer us a possibility of victory. Such an upheaval could only be organized, and the permanence of an eventual victory could only be guaranteed with the help of the Western powers. Only the Western powers could facilitate the creation of an organic, militant collaboration with the representatives of the enslaved nations of Europe for the liberation of our countries. End quote. If war, as they say, makes strange bedfellows, the same could just as easily be said of a fragile peace. When the members of the short-lived Romanian national government fled Vienna in March 1945, they split off in different directions, hoping only to save their own skins. where they found themselves immediately after Germany's surrender, very much depended on their prior associations. Horia Sima and the greater part of his followers wound up in Paris, while the dissenters concentrated around Constantin Papanas gathered in Italy. Thanks to the relative obscurity of the organization outside of Romania, the members of the Iron Guard were able to keep a low profile, and therefore avoided being prosecuted for war crimes. The governments of these Western European countries, vaguely aware of the movement's fascist nature, could only tolerate their presence up to a certain point. After encountering difficulty in securing permanent residency in France, Sima decided to relocate to Spain sometime around 1947. A sizable community of Romanian émigrés centered around Sima sprung up in Madrid. They were treated generously by the Spanish government under Francisco Franco, with many receiving a modest pension. In Spain, Sima dedicated his efforts to writing pro-Western, anti-communist, and anti-Semitic literature, which was published through Francoist media outlets. These writings circulated widely through legionary communities in Europe and North America. With the exception of the relatively small and increasingly irrelevant Papanas faction, Sima remained the universally recognized leader of the legionary movement until 1954, when he was disavowed by the movement due to a scandal involving his alleged fathering of an illegitimate child by a female legionary. In response, Sima issued a circular stating his intention to end his career by parachuting into Romania and dying a martyr. This plan did not materialize. He continued to live out his comfortable existence in Spain until his death in 1993 at the age of 86. In general, the Gardists living in exile managed to avoid facing serious repercussions for their past misdeeds. This held true even for those who continued to openly voice their beliefs, like Sima and Sturza. The most notable exception was the case of Viorel Trifa. The former president of the Legionary Students' Association and a prominent participant in the events of January 1941, Trifa escaped to Italy after the dissolution of the Vienna government in 1945. For the next 4 years, he worked in a Catholic seminary in the town of Pesaro as a professor of classics. Side note, between 1945 and 1950, Catholic clergy provided significant assistance to legionaries and other fascist exiles residing in majority Catholic countries, sheltering them and later facilitating their migration elsewhere. This led some legionaries, most notably Ilie Garniata, to convert to Catholicism in the hopes of using connections within the church to advance their own ambitions. Anyway, after Trifa failed to secure a permit of permanent residence in Italy, Catholic clergy assisted him in immigrating to the United States. In 1950, he applied for admission into the U.S. under the Displaced Persons Act of 1948. He qualified on the basis of his claim that he had been interned at the Buchenwald concentration camp, which was technically correct. His application was approved and he moved to the state of Michigan, where a large number of Romanian émigrés already resided. Trifa was supported by the Romanian Orthodox Church in North America, headquartered in Grass Lake, a town some 70 miles west of Detroit. At first, he worked as a writer for the church's official newspaper. Later, he joined the clergy himself, and in 1952, he was elected the Archbishop of Detroit. This was a highly influential position. He was effectively the spiritual leader of the Romanian Orthodox Church in North America, a denomination of approximately 35 to 40,000 people. During his tenure as Archbishop, Trifa joined the executive board of the National Council of Churches and even delivered an opening prayer before a session of the United States Senate. Despite his high profile, Trifa successfully managed to keep his fascist past hidden for nearly 15 years, all the more surprising considering that he kept his same surname and first initial. He took the ecclesiastical name Valerian after being ordained. It was not until 1975 that the American government began to seriously look into his background. Following a tip provided by one Charles Kremer, a retired dentist turned professional Nazi hunter, and Constantin Antonovici, a parishioner who was angry at Trifa for not defrocking a priest that he had a personal dispute with. The Department of Justice opened an investigation into Archbishop Trifa on the basis that he had failed to disclose his past involvement with the Iron Guard on his immigration forms. When information about Trifa's past came to light, it became a genuine public scandal in the US. Jewish activist organizations staged protest outside the headquarters of the National Council of Churches, and American newspapers followed the story closely. Trifa denied the allegations. Even when presented with text of the incendiary speech he delivered on the eve of the Bucharest Rebellion. Eventually, investigators discovered a postcard addressed to Heinrich Himmler by Trifa, tucked away in a German archive, with the latent fingerprint still on it. In 1980, after 5 years of proceedings, Trifa gave up. He voluntarily relinquished his American citizenship to avoid being put on trial and/or extradited to Romania. He then immigrated to Portugal in 1984, where he died 3 years later. He continued to deny wrongdoing until his final days. In an interview given to the New York Times just prior to his self-deportation, he argued that he had been treated unfairly by a certain unnamed group who wanted to make an example out of him. Quote, "I am a man who just happens to live at a moment in time when some people wanted to make a point about the Holocaust. But mark my words, all of this talk about the Holocaust is going to backfire." End quote. While I can't say that I sympathize with Trifa's plight, I can understand why he felt betrayed by the US government's decision to pursue the case against him, considering how willing that same government was to work with other elements of the Legionary movement in pursuit of their Cold War objectives. There is a lot more I would have liked to discuss about the lives of ex-legionaries in the United States. I haven't even touched on the most famous of them, the renowned scholar of religion Mircea Eliade, who was a professor at my alma mater, the University of Chicago. Unfortunately, Eliade's story will have to wait for now. This episode has gone on for quite a while, and I think that it's time that I brought this episode and this series to a close. I wanted to conclude this series with a few words about the legacy of the Iron Guard today, but the truth of the matter is that outside of Romania, the Iron Guard really doesn't have much of a legacy. That is to say, they remain a relatively obscure organization. In the first episode of this series, I stated that the Iron Guard was unique in that it emerged independently of German or Italian fascism, and 2, was one of the few interwar European fascist movements to acquire a mass character and come to power without foreign assistance. And yet, despite these facts, the movement remains a remarkably understudied topic. And after having done the research for the series, I have a couple theories as to why that is the case. Firstly, Romanian society did not undergo a national reckoning with the legacy of fascism like other countries did, at least not immediately. The communist government has been accused of minimizing this particular aspect of the country's history, a trend which continued well after its fall. This was why the work of the International Commission on the Holocaust in Romania, specifically its 2004 report, was considered so significant. In the Legion's case, it helped that they were removed from the picture by 1941, and thereby avoided, in spite of themselves, being tried as war criminals. Second, to scholars of fascism in its many other iterations, the Iron Guard defies simple categorization. Their ideological idiosyncrasies, especially the metaphysical aspects, can make the movement difficult to write about. One easily becomes lost and confused trying to make sense of the Legion's eschatological doctrine, their steadfast belief in the palingenetic rebirth of the Romanian nation, their morbid fixation on death and martyrdom, their mystical beliefs about the purity of the legionary soul, and so on. I have tried to explain these and other concepts to the best of my ability, but more importantly, I've endeavored not to lose sight of the material realities of the movement. In the first episode, I mentioned how, at first glance, the conditions of interwar Romania did not appear particularly well suited for the rise of a native fascist movement. Setting aside any preconceptions one might have from studying the rise of fascism in other countries, we can observe that after World War I, Romania was an unindustrialized country with a fragile, relatively new liberal democracy. Its population was for the most part made up of poor and overwhelmingly religious peasants. The Romanian bourgeoisie, the educated class, was small, weak, and insecure, living in a constant state of economic precarity. The ruling class was hopelessly corrupt. There was no party of organized labor or any other domestic political force that could act as a countercurrent to the prevailing nationalism of the day. Under such conditions, how could a movement like the Legion not have come into being? How could a figure like Cornelieu Codreanu not have risen to prominence? Within the context of interwar Romania, the Iron Guard could function as a radical party. The radical party, really. They could appeal to the disenfranchised and the downwardly mobile. They could harness their revolutionary potential and direct it at their enemies, both real and imagined. They could even seize power, but crucially, they could not wield it. The qualities that had led them to victory in the struggle, their passion, their fierce adherence to their beliefs, their willingness to deal death and receive it in equal measure, none of these are qualities that, once in power, are conducive to keeping it. It takes a high level of political skill to transmute these things into stability. The new men of the Legion were simply not up to the task. In his book Varieties of Fascism, historian Eugen Weber summarizes the trajectory of the Iron Guard's history in a way that I think makes for a fitting epitaph. Quote, "In the Nest Leader's Manual, Codreanu had written, 'We do not care at all whether we shall win, whether we shall be broken, whether we shall die. Our aim is another, to advance forward, united, together. But unity is not enough. The question inevitably rises, unity to what end? And in that regard, the answer remained purposefully vague. Anybody can draw up a political program overnight,' said Codreanu. 'That is not what the country needs. What the country needs is new men, better men. Legionaries are men of a faith, of a great spiritual school, and one can trust them above any other group of men held together only by a mere program. For the moment, the Legion's program can be summarized in 3 points. 1. Create force. 2. Use this force to defeat all opposing force. 3. Then, and only then, apply the program properly so called. But once that leader was dead, the program, properly so called, became nearly impossible to formulate, and the savage forces that the Legion had exalted became harder and harder to restrain. From a means of expiration, death became an end unto itself, and transcendence, replaced by Gotterdämmerung, turned high ideals into a sordid doom." End quote. And it is on that note that I will bring this episode and this series to a close. Thank you for listening to the end. Despite the somewhat morbid subject matter, I sincerely hope that you enjoyed this series of the Perspectives in History podcast on the Iron Guard. And just as importantly, I hope that you learned something from it as well. What are your thoughts about the Iron Guard? Was there anything in the series that was perhaps unclear or confusing? Anything that I omitted? Do you just have comments or maybe suggestions for future topics of the show? As always, these and all other queries can be directed to me via the show's email, perspectivesinhistorypod@gmail.com. As I said at the top of the show, after this the podcast will go into hiatus from now until early September, at which point we will begin a new series on a yet-to-be-determined topic, so please stay tuned for the show's return in a few months. In the meantime, I encourage you to check out the show's website, which I am currently in the process of revamping with supplemental material for the podcast. A link to the website will be in the episode description. And finally, if you like the show and want to help keep it running for the foreseeable future, please consider leaving a review for it on whichever podcast listening platform you prefer, or purchase some used books from my eBay page. A link will be in the episode description as well. Anyway, this has been the Perspectives in History podcast. Thank you very much for listening. I'm your host, Willem Connor, signing off.